There is still a sense of shock and disbelief from students who live in and around this complex, 21 Rio, where Brianna Aguilera was found dead outside of. And like us, they have lots of questions for Austin police. That's why Brianna's mother is demanding a thorough investigation.
And it's just so unbearable and unimaginable what happened to her that night. And I don't have answers. I don't have any answers.
It's a mother's plea to Austin police. Stephanie Rodriguez wants to know what led to her 19-year-old daughter Brianna Aguilera's death, and so do students who live nearby.
Why did it take 16 hours? Who decided Rodriguez didn't need to be notified immediately? A mother tracks her daughter's phone through the night, begging Austin police to help find her missing 9-year-old, only to be told she must wait 24 hours to file a report. But her daughter's body is already lying in the morgue, has been there since 1 a.m., and no one bothers to call Rodriguez until 4 p.m. the next day. A 9-year-old honor student with a 4 gigapascals plummets 17 stories from an Austin high-rise during what should have been a celebration weekend. Her phone mysteriously switched to Do Not Disturb, 15 people in the apartment where she fell, and police waiting 16 hours to tell her frantic mother that her daughter's body was already in the morgue. The investigators say Brianna Aguilera jumped. Her mother says that's impossible, and the evidence she's uncovered suggests someone isn't telling the truth. What happened in apartment 1701 at 21 Rio on the night Texas A&M played their biggest rival? Subscribe to Crazy Crime Lures. Brianna Aguilera wasn't just any college student, she was the kind of young woman who made everyone around her believe in possibility. Born in Laredo, Texas, she was set to celebrate her 20th birthday in January 2026. A milestone she'd been looking forward to with a kind of infectious enthusiasm that defined everything she did. Her mother, Belle Rodriguez, describes a daughter who never settled for anything less than excellence, and Brianna's academic record proved it. A perfect 4 gigapascals at one of the most demanding universities in the nation. She attended Texas A&M University in College Station, where she'd been accepted into the prestigious Bush School of Government and Public Service. This wasn't a school you stumbled into. It was where future diplomats, policymakers, and changemakers were forged. Brianna had her eyes set on law school, dreaming of becoming an attorney who could make a real difference. She was a junior, which meant she was just 1 year away from earning her Aggie ring, a symbol of achievement that Texas A&M students wear with fierce pride. Before Texas A&M, Brianna had already distinguished herself at United High School in Laredo, where she graduated magna cum laude. She wasn't just buried in books, though. Brianna was a cheerleader, someone who understood the value of team spirit and showing up for others. Those who knew her from high school remember someone who could light up a room, whose smile was genuine, whose ambition was tempered with kindness. Her relationship with her family was the foundation of everything. She was especially close to her younger brothers, the kind of big sister who took them to see movies like Wicked during Thanksgiving break, making ordinary moments special. She'd spent that Thanksgiving just days before her death at home in Laredo with her family, sharing meals, laughter, and plans for the future that would never materialize. Brianna's friends at Texas A&M knew her as someone reliable, someone who kept her commitments and showed up when she said she would. She was involved in campus life, passionate about her studies, and already thinking about the LSAT and law school applications. Her weekends typically involved studying or carefully planned social activities. She wasn't someone who made impulsive decisions or lost control. What made Brianna particularly unique was her balance. She could ace a political science exam and then spend hours helping a friend through a problem. She understood that success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about lifting others as you climbed. Her professors at the Bush School had noticed her potential, and several had already offered to write recommendation letters for her law school applications. This wasn't someone struggling academically, socially, or emotionally. This was a young woman who had mapped out her future and was methodically, successfully working toward it. Every person who knew Brianna describes the same thing. Someone with everything to live for, someone who'd never expressed suicidal thoughts, someone who approached life with optimism and determination. And here's what makes what happened next so impossible for those who loved her to accept. Brianna was terrified of heights, not just uncomfortable, genuinely, deeply afraid. The idea that she would willingly approach the edge of a 17th-floor balcony, let alone go over it, contradicted everything her family and friends knew about her most fundamental fears. The weekend of November 28 to 29, 2025, was one of the biggest in Texas college football. Texas A&M versus the University of Texas, a rivalry game that brought thousands of Aggies to Austin. Brianna had been invited to attend the game festivities by friends who lived in Austin, specifically at an apartment complex called 21 Rio on Rio Grande Street, right near the UT campus. These weren't random acquaintances. The people in that apartment were part of Brianna's extended social circle from Texas A&M, connections she'd made through university life. The exact nature of how she knew each person in the apartment that night remained somewhat murky. Some were friends of friends, others were classmates, but the important detail is that she felt safe enough to travel nearly 2 hours from College Station to Austin to spend the weekend with them. The apartment belonged to one of these acquaintances, someone who had apparently opened their doors to multiple people for the game weekend. This wasn't unusual major rivalry. Weekends often meant friends crashing on couches, floors, anywhere there was space. The atmosphere was supposed to be celebratory, a chance for Aggies to gather before heading to the game. But according to Brianna's mother, there was tension in this group that Brianna might not have been fully aware of. Belle Rodriguez has stated that there was a conflict between Brianna and another girl in the apartment, and that text messages exist proving this confrontation occurred. The exact nature of this dispute hasn't been made public, but Rodriguez insists it's relevant to understanding what happened to her daughter. What Brianna knew about the people in that apartment, what warnings she might have missed or ignored, what dynamics were at play, these are questions that haunt her family. Did she sense any danger? Did she notice anything off about the evening before it was too late? Her mother's last conversation with her, ending around 6 p.m. Friday evening, gave no indication that Brianna felt unsafe or wanted to leave. The people in that apartment saw something that night. 15 individuals, according to Rodriguez, were present at the time of Brianna's death. 15 potential witnesses to whatever actually happened. And yet, as her family would soon discover, getting consistent answers from those 15 people would prove nearly impossible. Friday, the 28th of November 2025, Black Friday was supposed to be perfect. The weather in Austin that day was mild for late November, the kind of Texas autumn evening where you could be comfortable outside without a jacket, ideal for tailgating and celebrating before the big game the next day. Brianna's day had started back in Laredo, where she'd spent the morning wrapping up Thanksgiving celebrations with her family. She'd taken her younger brothers to see Wicked at a local theater, one of those big sister moments that would later seem impossibly precious. They'd laughed together, shared popcorn, talked about school and life. By early afternoon, she'd packed her overnight bag and started the drive north toward Austin. The journey from Laredo to Austin is roughly 4 hours depending on traffic, which meant Brianna likely hit the road around 2 or 3 p.m. to arrive in time for evening festivities. Her mother, Belle Rodriguez, stayed in contact with her during this drive. They texted back and forth casual conversation, the kind of checking in that mothers do with daughters who are driving alone. Everything about these exchanges was normal, routine, unremarkable. Brianna arrived at the 21 Rio apartments on Rio Grande Street as the sun was beginning to set. The building is a modern high-rise popular with students, located in the heart of West Campus, the neighborhood adjacent to the University of Texas that's packed with apartment towers, restaurants, and the constant buzz of college life. She made her way up to the 17th floor, to an apartment that was already filling with people preparing for the game weekend. According to police reports later shared with her mother, there was a tailgate party happening, but not at the apartment. This was an off-site gathering, and importantly, it was a gathering where alcohol was being served to underage people. Brianna, at 19, would have been 2 years shy of the legal drinking age, but at college tailgates, especially during major rivalry weekends, enforcement is often lax. What happened at that tailgate remains contested. Police told Rodriguez that Brianna became intoxicated and was asked to leave, essentially kicked out of the party. This characterization troubles the family because it implies Brianna was out of control or causing problems, which contradicts everything they know about her behavior at social events. She wasn't someone who overindulged or made scenes. She was measured, responsible, the kind of person who knew her limits. But let's say the police account is accurate. Brianna did drink, did become intoxicated, and did return to the apartment earlier than planned. This would have been sometime in the early evening, perhaps around 7 or 8 p.m., though the exact timeline hasn't been specified. Her mother's last communication with her was around 6 p.m. After that, Brianna's phone went silent. This is where the first major red flag appears. Someone, either Brianna herself or someone else, put her phone on Do Not Disturb mode. For Rodriguez, this single detail is crucial. She insists that Brianna never used that setting unless she was in class or studying for an important exam. It wasn't something she'd turn on casually at a social gathering, especially on a weekend when she might need to be reachable. So Brianna was back at apartment 1701 at 21 Rio. The apartment was filling with more people as the evening progressed, eventually, according to her mother, reaching 15 individuals total. That's a significant crowd for an apartment. The kind of density where conversations overlap, where it's hard to keep track of everyone, where someone could slip away without being noticed immediately. The hours between roughly 7 p.m. Friday and 1 a.m. Saturday represent a black hole in the timeline, 6 or 7 hours where we have conflicting accounts and enormous gaps in the narrative. What was Brianna doing during this time? Who was she talking to? Where exactly was she in the apartment? Was she trying to reach her mother but couldn't because her phone was on Do Not Disturb? Was someone preventing her from making calls? According to the friends later interviewed by police, they claim they didn't know Brianna's whereabouts during the critical hours.
We was actually trying to get into the apartment and the whole street was blocked off.
UT student Dana Rodriguez says Aguilera was staying in a unit across the hall from her on the 17th floor.
So were you thinking like, oh, this is just like normal party stuff? Do you hear stuff like that a lot here?
I do, but this was like kind of different.
Rodriguez tells us she heard arguing coming from the apartment, which lines up with what Aguilera's mom reportedly found on her daughter's phone. Text messages showing that the teen was fighting with one of the girls she was staying with that weekend.
I heard a lot of running, and then we started hearing screaming and stuff. My parents said that it sounded like, something really bad happened, and that's why we were a little suspicious.
But here's where the story fractures. If they didn't know where she was, how could they also claim to police that she jumped? You can't witness someone jumping if you don't know where they are. This logical impossibility is something Rodriguez has pointed out repeatedly. The stories don't align. What we do know is that tension existed in that apartment. The text messages Rodriguez references, the ones she says, prove a confrontation between Brianna and another girl, likely date from this evening, perhaps even these specific hours. A fight in a crowded apartment during a party weekend, raised voices, hurt feelings, maybe alcohol fueling conflict that wouldn't have happened sober. These are normal, unfortunate parts of college social life. But what happens when a confrontation escalates? When 15 people are milling around and someone is angry? Staff members at 21 Rio, if they noticed anything unusual about apartment 1701 that evening, haven't spoken publicly. There's no indication that neighbors complained about noise or that security was called. Everything appeared normal from the outside. As midnight approached and then passed, most people would have been getting ready for the big game the next day, winding down, preparing for bed, or continuing to party into the early morning. The apartment complex was likely quiet in that way, late-night buildings or some lights still on, some music still playing, but most people settling in. At some point during these lost hours, Brianna ended up on or near the balcony of that 17th-floor apartment. Whether she walked there herself, whether she was alone, whether she felt unsafe, these are the questions that keep her mother awake at night. Because at approximately 12:47 a.m., on November 29, someone called 911. The balcony of apartment 1701 at 21 Rio sits 17 stories above Rio Grande Street, roughly 170 feet of empty air between the railing and the pavement below. From that height, Austin's West Campus neighborhood spreads out in a grid of towers and streetlights, the kind of view that would be breathtaking if you weren't afraid of heights. But Brianna Aguilera was terrified of heights, a fear so pronounced her family says she avoided even looking over high railings. What happened on that balcony in the early morning darkness of the 29th of November, 2025, remains the central mystery of this case. What we know with certainty is that at some point between midnight and 12:47 a.m., Brianna Aguilera went over the railing and fell 17 stories to the street below. The distance from the 17th floor to the ground would take approximately 3 to 4 seconds to fall. 3 to 4 seconds of absolute terror, of wind rushing, of the ground approaching with impossible speed, of the human brain unable to process what's happening. A fall from that height is almost universally fatal. The human body simply cannot withstand the force of impact when falling from 170 feet. Internal organs rupture, bones shatter, catastrophic trauma occurs in milliseconds. But before we get to the impact, we need to understand the physics and logistics of going over a balcony railing. These aren't low barriers you can easily stumble over. Modern apartment balconies, especially in high-rises, have railings that are waist height or higher, specifically designed to prevent accidental falls. You can't trip over them, you can't lean too far and accidentally topple. Going over a balcony railing requires one of 3 scenarios. You climb it intentionally, you're lifted over it, or you're pushed with enough force to carry you over it. If Brianna jumped, as police initially suggested, she would have had to approach the railing, something her family insists her fear of heights made nearly impossible, then either climb onto it and leap, or jump with enough force to clear the barrier. Both scenarios require not just intent, but significant physical effort and the ability to override one's survival instinct, which is particularly strong in people with a pronounced fear of heights. What was happening in the moments before she went over? Was she alone on that balcony, or was someone with her? The 15 people in the apartment that night, what were they doing? Were they witnesses to what happened, or were they in other rooms, unaware until they heard screaming from outside? Brianna's body struck the pavement of Rio Grande Street with devastating force. A passerby walking in the area was the one who discovered her. Coming upon a scene of incomprehensible tragedy, a young woman's body lying broken on the street, looking up at the tower of lit windows above, one of which had just expelled a human life. The weapon in this case, if we're thinking of it as anything other than a tragic accident or suicide, was gravity itself, and the 17 floors of empty space between the balcony and the ground. But gravity requires a catalyst. Something or someone had to initiate that fall. And this is where the case becomes impossibly complex, because we're left with competing narratives that cannot all be true. If the people in the apartment knew Brianna had gone onto the balcony, why didn't anyone stop her? If they claimed they didn't know where she was, then who opened the balcony door? Who was the last person to see her inside? Did anyone hear a struggle, a scream, a cry for help? Or did Brianna go silently into the night, her phone on Do Not Disturb, unable to call for help even if she'd wanted to? The timing creates another troubling question. Why was 911 called at 12:47 a.m.? Who made that call? If Brianna had jumped or fallen minutes earlier, was there a delay before someone noticed? Or did someone in the apartment know immediately what had happened? The gap between when she went over and when emergency services were notified could be seconds or could be many minutes, and that gap matters because it speaks to whether people in the apartment witnessed the fall or discovered what happened afterward. There's a detail here that Brianna's mother finds particularly haunting. While Brianna was either falling or lying dead on the street below, the people in apartment 1701 were still inside. 15 individuals who had been partying, talking, occupying the same space where Brianna had been just moments before. What were they saying to each other? What were they deciding? Because here's the part that made detectives pause. By the time police began seriously investigating, several of these crucial witnesses had already left Austin, and the person who lived in apartment 1701 had moved out of the building entirely. The evidence left at the scene was Brianna's body, her injuries consistent with a fall from extreme height. There was no suicide note found on her person or in her belongings. There was no social media post suggesting intent to harm herself. Her last text to her mother hours earlier had been completely normal. The balcony railing showed no signs of being damaged or broken. Whatever happened, happened quickly and left little physical evidence beyond the tragic result. But here's what makes this crime, or accident, or suicide so difficult to categorize. We don't know what Brianna was doing in the minutes before she fell. We don't know if she was alone. We don't know if she was scared. We don't know if she called out for help. The people who might know these answers have given conflicting statements, and some have gone silent entirely. The passerby who found Brianna's body on Rio Grande Street at approximately 1 a.m. was confronted with a scene that would haunt anyone. A young woman lying motionless on the pavement beneath a tower of lit apartments, her injuries obviously catastrophic. They immediately called 911, their voice likely shaking as they tried to describe the location and what they were seeing. Austin Police Department officers arrived at the scene at precisely 12:47 a.m., according to official records. They found Brianna where she'd landed, still wearing the clothes she'd put on that morning in Laredo when life was normal and her future was infinite. Emergency medical personnel arrived within minutes, but their role was limited to what's called pronouncement, officially declaring what was already evident. At 12:57 a.m., just 10 minutes after officers arrived, Brianna Aguilera was pronounced dead at the scene. The speed of that pronouncement tells you everything about the severity of her injuries. There was no rush to the hospital, no frantic attempts at resuscitation, no desperate measures to save her life. From a fall of 17 stories, survival is not impossible but is extraordinarily rare, and Brianna's injuries were clearly incompatible with life. She had died either on impact or within moments afterward. While first responders were working below on Rio Grande Street, securing the scene and beginning their initial assessment, what was happening 17 floors above them in apartment 1701? This is where the timeline becomes murky in ways that trouble Brianna's family. According to Belle Rodriguez, the apartment from which her daughter fell was never properly searched that night. Police didn't immediately go door to door in the building. They didn't secure the apartment as a potential crime scene. The 15 people who had been in that space were not separated and interviewed immediately at police stations, which is standard procedure when there's any question about how someone died. Instead, incredibly, those interviews wouldn't happen until 1 p.m. The following day, more than 12 hours after Brianna's body was discovered. 12 hours for memories to fade, for stories to align, for anyone who might want to obscure the truth to get their narrative straight. The person who lived in apartment 1701 did something that Rodriguez finds deeply suspicious. They moved out of the building shortly after Brianna's death. Not weeks later, not months later shortly after. And several of the people who had been at the apartment that night left Austin immediately, returning to College Station or wherever they'd come from for the game weekend. How is that not suspicious behavior? Rodriguez has asked publicly. If you witnessed someone die, if you were trying to help police understand what happened, wouldn't you stay? Wouldn't you make yourself available? But while police were processing the scene below and eventually making their way up to the 17th floor, and while witnesses were scattering, Belle Rodriguez was in Laredo, experiencing every parent's nightmare in agonizing slow motion. She'd been trying to reach Brianna since the evening before, sending texts that weren't being read, making calls that went to voicemail. By late Friday night, she was worried enough to track her daughter's phone location. Modern parents often have this capability through apps designed for family safety. The phone was pinging in Austin, near Waller Creek, which made no sense. Why would Brianna's phone be near a creek? Rodriguez called the Austin Police Department sometime during the night, explaining that her daughter wasn't responding and she could see her location. She wanted to file a missing person report, but police told her what they tell many worried parents. She had to wait 24 hours before they could officially consider someone missing. This is where the system's bureaucratic rules collided with a mother's instinct that something was terribly wrong. Rodriguez knew her daughter. She knew Brianna wouldn't just stop responding, wouldn't turn off her phone, or put it on Do Not Disturb during a social weekend, wouldn't ignore her mother's increasingly frantic attempts to reach her. But policy is policy, and police couldn't or wouldn't act on her concerns. So Rodriguez spent Friday night into Saturday morning in an agony of not knowing, watching her daughter's phone location, trying to convince herself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Brianna's phone had died. Maybe she'd lost it. Maybe she was having too much fun to check messages. Parents cycle through these hopeful explanations even as dread builds in their chest. Saturday morning came. Rodriguez kept calling police, kept calling Brianna's phone, kept checking the location. The phone was eventually recovered by officers, though the details of where and when remain vague, but still no one called Rodriguez to tell her what had happened to her daughter. Hour after hour passed. Morning became afternoon. Rodriguez was now well past the 24-hour waiting period. She called Austin police again, demanding answers, insisting something was wrong, and finally, at 4 p.m. on Saturday, 16 hours after her daughter's body had been found, 16 hours after Brianna had been pronounced dead, someone from the police department called Belle Rodriguez and told her that her daughter was in the Travis County morgue. Not "there's been an accident," not "we need you to come identify someone," just "your daughter is in the morgue." The casual cruelty of that notification, the 16-hour delay while Rodriguez suffered in ignorance, believing her daughter might still be found alive, this is something the family cannot forgive. Why did it take 16 hours? Who decided Rodriguez didn't need to be notified immediately? What were police doing during those 16 hours, if not trying to contact the next of kin? These are questions that Assistant Police Chief Lee Rogers would later have to address, and his answers would not satisfy the grieving family. The Austin Police Department's investigation into Brianna Aguilera's death officially began in the early morning hours of November 29, but the critical first hours when evidence is freshest, when witnesses' memories are most reliable, when the scene itself can tell stories were apparently mishandled in ways that have left permanent holes in the case. The lead detective assigned to the case worked under Assistant Police Chief Lee Rogers, who would become the public face of the department's investigation. But before we get to what they did, we need to understand what they didn't do in those crucial first hours. They didn't immediately seal off apartment 1701 as a potential crime scene. They didn't separate and individually interview the 15 people who'd been present. They didn't collect phones and devices to preserve text messages and social media posts, and they didn't treat the scene with the urgency that a questionable death demands. The investigative methods eventually employed included standard death investigation protocols, photographing the scene where Brianna's body was found, documenting the position and condition of her body, measuring distances and angles, and examining the area for any physical evidence that might explain what happened. Crime scene technicians processed the street location, looking for anything that might have been dropped from above or that Brianna might have been carrying. The balcony from which Brianna fell was eventually examined, but not until hours after her death. By then, any evidence that might have been present, fingerprints on the railing, signs of a struggle, items knocked over during a confrontation could have been compromised or cleaned. The apartment itself, according to Rodriguez's cousin Belle Fernandez, was never properly searched. If there were overturned furniture, broken items, bloodstains, or anything else suggesting violence or struggle, investigators apparently didn't document it thoroughly enough to satisfy the family's questions. Forensic evidence collection focused on Brianna's body and her personal effects. Her phone was recovered, though the exact location where it was found hasn't been made clear publicly, and this became a crucial piece of evidence. The phone was on Do Not Disturb mode, something Rodriguez insists her daughter would never do in a social setting. Who set it to that mode? Was it Brianna herself, perhaps seeking quiet time to deal with whatever was troubling her? Or did someone else silence her phone, perhaps to prevent her from calling for help? Phone records would show the timeline of Brianna's communications that evening, her last text to her mother around 6 p.m., any calls or messages after that, and crucially, whether she'd tried to reach anyone, family, friends, or emergency services in the hours before her death. Digital forensics teams would examine her text messages, including the ones Rodriguez has referenced that allegedly show conflict between Brianna and another girl at the apartment. CCTV footage became another critical investigative avenue. The 21 Rio apartments, like most modern high-rises, has security cameras in common areas, lobbies, elevators, hallways. This footage would show Brianna entering the building Friday evening, who she was with, whether she appeared intoxicated or distressed, and who came and went from the building in the hours around her death. Did the cameras capture any of the 15 people leaving the building suspiciously quickly after 1 a.m.? Did they show Brianna in the hallway outside apartment 1701 at any point? Critically, would the footage show anyone entering or exiting the apartment around the time of Brianna's fall? If someone pushed her and then left immediately, the cameras would have captured it. If everyone stayed in the apartment after her fall, the cameras would show that too. Rogers would later state that investigators were reviewing Aguilera's movements and interactions throughout the day, suggesting this footage was indeed examined, but specific findings haven't been made public. Witness interviews, when they finally happened at 1 p.m. on Saturday, would have focused on reconstructing the evening. Who saw Brianna last? What state she was in? Whether she said anything concerning, whether anyone witnessed the fall itself. But here's where the investigation hits its first major contradiction. Some of the people in the apartment told police they didn't know Brianna's whereabouts that night, yet police initially told Rodriguez that witnesses said Brianna had jumped. You cannot witness someone jumping if you don't know where they are. This logical impossibility suggests either the witnesses gave conflicting accounts or police mischaracterized what they were told. The text messages Rodriguez provided to police, the ones she says prove a confrontation between Brianna and another girl, were supposedly added to the evidence file. What did these messages say? Were they threatening? Did they show escalating conflict? Did they suggest any physical danger? Police haven't released this information, which frustrates the family's efforts to understand what motivated the events of that night. Toxicology testing on Brianna's body would be standard procedure conducted by the Travis County Medical Examiner's Office. These tests would reveal whether she had alcohol in her system, relevant given police claims that she'd been kicked out of a tailgate for intoxication, and whether any drugs, prescription or otherwise, were present. Results from toxicology screening typically take weeks or even months, and as of early December 2025, the medical examiner had not released an official cause of death determination. One of the investigation's most significant aspects was tracking down and interviewing all 15 people who'd been in apartment 1701. This is where the 12-hour delay in securing the scene becomes problematic. By the time police started formally interviewing witnesses at 1 p.m. Saturday, several had already left Austin. Investigators would need to track them down in College Station or elsewhere, conduct interviews days after the incident when memories had faded and the immediacy of the scene was lost. What were these 15 people saying to each other in those 12 hours before police interviewed them? Were they coordinating their stories? Were they genuinely trying to remember what happened? Or were some of them frightened about potential liability and constructing narratives that minimize their involvement? These are questions that plague Rodriguez, who believes the delay allowed crucial evidence, testimonial evidence, to be corrupted. The breakthrough moment in the investigation, if there was one, hasn't been publicly disclosed. Did forensic evidence definitively point toward suicide, accident, or homicide? Did witness testimony reveal a consistent narrative, or did the stories conflict? Did the CCTV footage show something definitive? Rogers would later tell media that findings continue to point to an accidental fall or suicide, but he also acknowledged the investigation was still open and has expanded in scope. What does expanded in scope mean? Are investigators looking at potential criminal charges? Are they examining whether intoxication or drug use by anyone in the apartment contributed to Brianna's death? Are they considering whether someone's actions, even if not directly causing her fall, created the circumstances that led to it? The handling of Brianna's personal effects raises additional questions. Fernandez has claimed that Brianna's phone and keys were given by police to non-family members. If true, this represents a serious breach of protocol. Evidence in a death investigation should be maintained in a chain of custody and eventually returned to next of kin, not handed off to acquaintances or friends. Who received these items? Why did police give them to anyone other than Rodriguez? What happened to Brianna's other belongings from that night? Her purse, her overnight bag, her car keys? As December 2025 arrived and the investigation stretched into its second week, the Austin Police Department maintained its position that no evidence of foul play had been found and that the death was not being investigated as a homicide. But they also conceded that the case remained open, that additional interviews were being conducted, and that they were still gathering information. This middle ground position, not a homicide, but not closed either, has left Rodriguez in limbo, unable to get definitive answers about what took her daughter's life.